We all know how it is. You just got your new Sony A7IV, you unbox it, thinking now you have a 10-bit full-frame camera, so all your shots must look great no matter what you're doing. But then you come home after a shoot, you have a look at your footage, and it doesn't look much different as your previous camera. I have a good message for you. You did not buy a bad camera. The A7IV is great. You just have to learn how to use it properly to get cinematic or professional looking shots with it. So in this video I will show you the right settings, how to shoot with the camera, and also how to color grade the footage. Let's go. Most settings on the A7IV are actually up to you, but if you want to make your footage more cinematic or professional, then there are like 2 or 3 settings that you definitely want to change. And the first one is that you want to choose picture profile PP8, because that is SLOG3 on that camera unless you changed it. And you want to shoot in SLOG3 because that gives you the highest dynamic range of the A7IV, which means that you can see more details in the highlights and the shadows at the same time. And SLOG3 requires that your camera can save a lot of information because it's a pretty flat picture profile, and that's why you want to choose 4:2 10-bit in your camera settings, because that gives you 4 times the amount of color information, and that greatly helps with color grading SLOG3 footage. If you have a bit slower computer, not one of the new M1 Max, then you might want to choose 420 10-bit, which still looks really good and works with SLOG3, but it's a bit less taxing on your computer later. So try that out in case you have problems editing the footage. When it comes to shooting with the A7IV, there are basically 3 aspects that are really important to get more cinematic or professional looking footage. It's kind of the same on every camera, especially the Sony A7S3 and FX3, because they are very similar. And the first one is that you really have to nail your exposure in the camera already. And there are basically 2 ways how to do that. The first one is that you can either expose for bright skin tones if you have a character in your shot. And the second one that I would recommend is to either overexpose by plus 1.7 EV or simply so that it looks good on your display. And you can only really do that, like making it so that it looks good on your display, on the A7IV, because it has 10-bit color and the noise levels are also super low. Like on previous cameras, A7III, etc., that was more that you always wanted to overexpose lock color profiles by plus 1.7 EV or sometimes even higher. But on this camera you don't have to do that. So if you don't have a character in your shot, it's quite easy. If it's just a landscape shot or so on, either expose plus 1.7 EV or simply make it so that it looks good on your display already and will be fine. But when you have a character in your shot, it's generally easier to use zebras for exposure, because bright skin tones should be exposed at around 50 to 55 in SLOG3. And setting zebra up for that is actually quite easy. You just go into your menu under exposure color, and there you find the point zebra display. Under that you can just choose either custom 1 or custom 2, it's really up to you. And there you go to standard range 52 and then plus minus 2. And I also set up a custom button to turn zebra on and off, so if I need zebra I can just press the button here in the middle of the wheel and it gets on. But if I don't want zebra, if it annoys me sometimes, I can just quickly turn that off. And that's easy then, because if you have set it up like that, you quickly want to get exposure for your character, you just turn your zebra on and you expose so that you see a zebra pattern on the bright parts of the skin, and then you know automatically that your shot is perfectly exposed. Of course, that only counts if you actually have bright skin in your shot. If you're completely in the shadow, for example, then it's also okay if it's a little bit darker. In that case, I would just expose so that it looks good on the display. And the 52 number is what works best for my skin. I figured that out over time, but if your skin is darker or brighter, you might also want to use another number there. In that case, I would just recommend you to play a bit around, get some shots at different zebra numbers, and then apply a conversion LUT, as I will show you in a minute in the color grading part of this video, and then just take the value that works best for your skin. And second, when shooting with the A7IV, is white balancing. You want to nail that in camera as well, because it saves you a lot of time in the edit. And there are multiple ways to get that right, or at least somewhat right. And the first one is that you can choose a white balance preset in the camera. I don't recommend automatic white balance. I generally go for either presets or I set completely manually. More to that in a second. And preset, it's pretty much self-explanatory. When you're outside and it's cloudy, you use the cloudy preset. When it's sunny, you use the sunny preset. And then when you scroll more down in the white balance menu, you can also set a custom white balance number. That's also quite straightforward. When it's sunny outside, you set it to 5600 Kelvin, and when it's cloudy outside, generally 6500. So these are the two main numbers that you should remember there. But both the presets and also just setting a number is not perfectly accurate, because your actual light might always be a little bit different from those presets or numbers, and you don't know that, you can't know. And that's why, as much as possible, I use gray cards here. Like, this is a bigger gray card that I use in my studio, and that's a smaller one which I use on the go when I'm outside. And there's also functionality in your white balance menu when you scroll even more down and you press right, where you have a marker in the center of the frame, and there you only have to hold the gray card over the marker and press enter, and then it automatically captures the white balance with the gray card. And important when working with gray cards is that you hold it into the light that you want to get the white balance of. Here's actually a good example right now. I have pretty cold light coming from the window, while here my key light is a bit warmer. And that's why when I wanted to set my white balance, I had to hold the card something like that, so that my key light falls on the card. If I would hold it like that, then you can actually see like the gray looks a bit bluish. Not sure if that's still the case after I color graded. I always go a bit crazy there. But yeah, it would make the image then a bit warmer, and therefore the white balance would be wrong. So that's important when you work with gray cards. It's also important before you use your gray card that you set your exposure right at first, because otherwise, if the gray card is a bit too dark or too bright, that can also affect the white balance. And the third important thing when it comes to shooting with the A7 IV and every other camera, if you want to have professional or cinematic looking footage, is that you use light in a proper way. And that generally just means that you want to use light so that it creates depth. It generally means that you want to place the light source behind your subject, because that creates a rim light around your body, what separates the body from the background. Also counts for every other subject, like if you film some cars or plants or whatever you want to film, whatever you get in front of your camera, it's generally good to have a light source behind it because of that rim light effect. But rim light is not the only thing, it's also about throwing shadows over your subject. You can see that, for example, right now here, I positioned my key light not right in front of me, but within an angle, so that it throws a shadow here over my face. It's not perfect because the window light here is pretty bright, so I would actually like to have a bit more shadow here over my face and only a slight rim light effect. I can't really get that here right now. Not ideal, but I think it still looks good enough. So to bring that together quick and easily, you generate depth in your shots by using shadows or backlighting to get this rim light effect. That's really all you have to know. If you don't have any control over your light source, especially when you're outside, then you can control the position of your character. So try to position your character in a way that it throws shadows on, like, over the face, over the character, or that you have this nice backlight effect. Also want to mention here that you can't always get it right, especially if you shoot outside, because you don't have any control over your light. You only have control over the position of your character. But especially if you shoot travel videos or so, for example, you just sometimes want to have a certain background. Let's say you have a speaker in front of a tourist attraction and you want to show that attraction in the background. In that case, I would rather go for having the right background than having the most cinematic look, because story and information is always more important than having the most professional or cinematic looking footage. Let's come to the scariest part, which is color grading, but it's actually not as bad as you might think. And a little side note here, what I talked about before, the rim light effect, this is pretty much what you see here right now. And I actually use my screen right now to create this rim light effect. So you don't even have to necessarily use professional lights to generate that. I just bumped up the brightness of the screen now so that it reflects a bit more on the edge of my body. And therefore you can directly see how much better my body separates from the background. Would already separate because of the difference in brightness and color, but that makes it even more obvious. Just some inspiration here, you don't necessarily need professional lights highlights to make stuff work. But let's talk about color grading your A7 IV footage, and there are basically 3 steps that you want to take. The first one is to convert the SLOG3 footage, which looks quite flat, to a normal looking image. Then in the second step you want to make some corrections when it comes to exposure, contrast and saturation especially, sometimes also white balance. Depends a bit on if you nailed it in camera perfectly or not, and even if you try it, you don't always nail it. I also don't always do it perfectly. And then the third step is that you apply your final look. So the workflow that I show you here is exactly the same in pretty much every video editor, just looks a little bit different, but I show that in Final Cut. And the first step here is that you want to apply a 3-way color correction, but you don't do anything with it right now. You just leave it as it is, and I will tell you in a second why. Because now the actual first step is to apply a conversion LUT, and there are different LUTs that you can choose to convert your footage, but you want to use something that actually looks cinematic, because that's what we're talking about here. And there's one free version or one free LUT that you can choose, and that is the Alistair Chapman LUT that you find on the Sony website. I will link that in the description below, so if you want to go for something free, just take that. But the LUTs that I use are the Phantom LUTs from Joel Famularo, because they emulate this Arri Alexa cinema camera look that you see in Hollywood movies, etc. And that is what I obviously prefer. I want to have the very best. These LUTs are not cheap, but they're absolutely worth it because they're really high quality and they make your footage look good instantly. And oftentimes it's already on a level where I could actually deliver the video directly as it is just after applying the LUT. And now in the next step we will use the color wheels that you applied before. And the reason why you applied them first before you applied the LUT is that you want to color grade or make your corrections before the LUT gets applied. So here in the 3-way color correction you simply make the necessary adjustments to make your shot look good. Mostly the exposure, where you use the first wheel to change the exposure of the whole shot, but then maybe your shadows are a little bit too dark, then you can lift them there to make them a bit brighter, or same counts for the midtones. You could also make your highlights darker or brighter depending on how you need it. So it's really up to you there. There are also temperature sliders, so if you feel like that the shot is a little bit too warm or too cold, you can use the temperature slider to adjust that. And the same counts for the tint slider. If your shot is a bit too green or too magenta looking, then just slide them around until it looks good. So after these first 2 steps, your footage should already look pretty good, and actually so good sometimes that you could already use it like that. But of course we also want to get a certain look for our footage oftentimes, and that is where the third step comes in. When it comes to the final look of your videos, you should at first remember that the cinematic characteristics are basically done already. Like if you shot in a way that generates depth, then that's a cinematic characteristic. But then also things like highlight roll off and having good looking skin tones, etc., that's done with the conversion LUTs that I recommended before. That's why that is so important. But now of course there is the final look that you want to use, and that is at first something that you just like personally, that you find looking good. But it is also important to think about what feelings your colors should communicate, and don't overcomplicate it here really. It's, for example, if you have a sad part in your video, then you could, for example, make it a bit more desaturated, moody looking, a bit darker maybe even, and also colder. While if you have a happy part in your video, you could make it a bit brighter and more vibrant, etc. So don't overcomplicate it here, just makes what comes natural then when you think about feelings in your videos. But generally when it comes to the looks, you have 2 ways on how to do that, or actually 3. Like the first one is that you simply apply a so-called creative LUT, or also finishing LUT it's called sometimes. And the second option is that you generate the look completely by yourself by color grading. And then the third option is that you do a LUT and some custom color grading. This is especially good if you want to emphasize certain emotions in your videos. So when it comes to choosing the LUT, you can use pretty much every creative or finishing LUT that you like from your favorite creators, if you like the look from them. For example, in my shop you find the Tange LUT pack, which is a finishing LUT pack, and you apply that at the end of the process to give it the final look. Brian Nangle also has LUT packs that I often use in my videos. Check them out as well, especially his first Explorer LUT pack, that's quite good. But when it comes to LUTs, it's also important to don't always use them at the highest intensity. Like under the LUT, you always find an intensity slider there. And if you have it at 100, oftentimes your footage looks a bit too saturated, etc. It's just too much. And by bringing that slider down, you dial that into a level where it actually looks good. So definitely do that. There are many videos on YouTube that just have this LUTs applied at 100%. It looks so bad. Please don't be one of these people. And then there's a second way to color grade completely by yourself, which is definitely more complicated, but it is worth learning how to do it because it gives you more creative freedom, and it also makes it easier for you to emphasize certain feelings in your shots. And what I do a lot when it comes to creating my final look is to use hue versus saturation curves. Like there's hue versus hue, hue versus saturation, and hue versus luminance that I use most of the time. And for example, when I'm outside and I have some green stuff, green plants, trees or whatever around me, then I usually want to go for a bit more moody color grade. So there I use the hue versus saturation curves at first, and I apply 3 points to mark the green tones, and then I pull the middle point down to decrease the saturation of the trees, for example. And then I do the exact same in the hue versus luminance curves, because there I can decrease the luminance, so I make the green tones a little bit darker, and that gives you this nice moody look in your green tones. At least, of course, you can do the same with other colors as well. So the hue versus saturation curves, they might look pretty difficult at first, but they're actually very easy to use. Just do it a bit like I showed you here, and you will get the hang of it pretty quickly. And aside from that, I also mentioned the third way, which is that you basically first apply the creative LUT, but in case you're not really happy with how it comes out perfectly, then you color grade a bit more after that to generate your final look. This is also what I oftentimes do, because just applying the creative LUT is not really what makes me satisfied all the time. But to be honest, there's so much you can do about that. It would be too much to explain all of that in this video. For that, you can check out my other color grading videos here in this tutorial, or my color grading course, which you will find a link to in the description below. And aside from that, I also want to emphasize here that you should not get too crazy about all this cinematic looking footage and so on, because that can easily make that you shoot less videos and then you enjoy it less. And especially here on YouTube, it's not about having the most cinematic footage all the time. It's more about the story that you tell or the information that you give. So focus more on that. And I actually did a video about that recently, which you will find here in the corner, where I teach you storytelling for YouTube. Aside from that, of course, if you enjoyed this video, please leave me a thumbs up and also consider subscribing. And I hope to see you in my other videos.